Hello there, welcome to Skeleton Key Productions. I'm Kwan Grows Kokon. Let's get into the video. So in today's video we're going to be talking about taxation, what it is, and to answer the very important question of is it theft? But before we do that, remember we have to subscribe, right? Subscribe, that way you're able to stay in, keep up to date with all of the latest videos. We post twice a week, so we're posting on Thursday and on Sunday. So definitely stay tuned for things, but if you don't subscribe, you might end up missing new content, so really important. Subscribe. If you like the video as well, give it a like, put a comment in the comment section, and let's get on to the rest of the video. So first of all, to answer the question of what is taxation, right? Essentially, all it is this, right? It's the way that governments generate revenue. So if we think about a private business, right? So we think of a business in the private sector, how they end up getting money is selling goods or services to their customers, and their customers voluntarily give money in exchange for those goods or services. Now, the inherent problem with regard to governments is this, right? What governments tend to specialize in are the goods and services that we need, but which people wouldn't necessarily pay for out of their own pocket. So the perfect example of this we can think of is a street light, right? So everyone who walks underneath that street light benefits from it, but it'd be very, very difficult to be able to generate enough revenue through voluntary means to pay for that street light, because even if you get people on that local street to be like, hey, let's chip in some money, essentially you're still going to have people come in and out of that street who don't live there, who've not paid for it, and therefore have not benefited from it, right? But this is why it's so important to really think about the need of government, right? Because that's just one example of street lighting, but we think about police, we think about defence, we think about having some sort of social protections like a welfare state, then it becomes very necessary to have government revenue and to have a reliable source of government revenue. And so far, governments have not worked out a voluntary means of raising revenue, and it's a bit like the inherent problem of charity, right? If in one year people are very generous and decide to give a lot of money, then that's great for the charity. If all of a sudden in the next year they decide to not give any money, well, that charity still has overhead, still has all those things, but also most importantly, the people who that charity is trying to help are without the means to support themselves, right? So if we think about that in the same way with government, we have to really recognise that to some extent the government does need to take money by force. So now we have to ask the very complex question of, is taxation theft? Now, if people are taking money from you by force, then that seems to fit the definition for theft. However, if someone robs you of something, right? Say they take your phone or they take your wallet or whatever it is, right? Now, to what extent, how often does someone mug you and then give you something in return for that, right? So if we think about theft as it actually is, it'd be the taking of something from you and you get nothing in return against your will, right? Now, if we think about it in terms of what government does, government takes money by force, yes, but it does give some level of return. Sometimes it's a direct return, something that directly benefits that particular taxpayer, but sometimes it can benefit in more indirect ways. So for instance, you might have gone to a private school, for instance, yeah, but you will still somewhere along the line be benefited from someone who was publicly educated, right? So, and in the same way we can think about with roads, right? We all drive along roads, so while some people might use the road more than others, it still is a thing of indirectly some of our money has gone towards something which benefits us in some way, right? So it's in terms of, is theft the right word? Theft is probably not the right word. A more accurate word would be extortion. Now, some people might take that as as a uncharitable interpretation. But if we think about extortion, right? Extortion is you don't have a choice in you paying for something, right? But you're going to get something back, but it's not going to be as it's not going to be as clearly efficient for you. It's not going to be something. It's not going to be the amount that you put in is not going to be exactly the value that you get back out of it, right? So it's a thing of, to some extent, one could argue that taxation is extortion. So unless you live out in the woods, far away from civilization, you've got guns and you protect yourself, you grow your own food, etc., etc. You're really like living out in the wilderness, far away from any kind of civilization and stuff, right? So unless you can work out an exact way, it doesn't matter whether the country is run by this person, that person, you're living out in the wilderness, right? So unless you're that person, right, and good luck to you, right? Unless you're that person, at some point you are going to and have benefited from some sort of government spending, right? So unless you're that person out there living your life and you're making money somehow, I don't know how, and the government's taxing you and you're going, I literally do not benefit from the government spending at all, then maybe for that one individual in a hypothetical sense, maybe you could argue that the government maybe you could argue that taxation is theft in that sense. But the vast majority of people, they consent to the money being taken. So if you give consent, it's not really theft. Like if I want to give you something, then it's not theft, because a lot of people are quite happy to pay their taxes. And again, like we say, you get something in return. By and large, you're getting something in return for it. So again, it's probably more accurate to say that it's extortion rather than theft. Right, so now we're going to have to look at what tax rates have been historically and what they are at the moment. So prior to World War One, so 1914, right? The UK are all different levels, whether it's national, county, or local, right? The amount of tax revenue that they have as a percentage of GDP was there about 10%, right? And in the US, when you take national, federal, state, and local, it was about 7% of GDP, right? Obviously, World War One sparked like an increase in government spending and therefore in taxation. But then by 1930, you could see it was around, I believe, 23% in the US. 23% in the UK and about 14% in the US, right? Or thereabouts. So what we start to see as time goes on is this expand. With World War II, with the creation of the welfare state in both countries, etc., etc. So you end up having a situation now whereby the UK government, at all different levels, taxes 37% of GDP, and the US tax roughly about 33%. So all these figures were from 2019. All the the recent figures for 2019. Okay, obviously with the current crisis and everything's all kind of out. Those figures will be very different. But so if you think about it, that is a significant amount of the economy. That's slightly over a third of the economy being taken as tax revenue, right? So in Britain, that's £803 billion. That's B, not million, B. And in America, it's $7 trillion, right? So that's 7 with 12 zeros after it, okay? So that's a significant amount. So if we think about that, how does that vary from one country to the next, right? So if we look at some countries, right, some countries have far more taxation than that. So a lot of places are a lot more like social democratic, a lot more kind of left wing on economics, one could say. And so they have a higher level of tax and a higher level of spending than us, maybe about 40%, maybe 50%, right? And then you have other places that are developing nations, whereby there's lots of levels of corruption, lots of levels where it's difficult to collect taxes and stuff, so the level of taxation and spending is relatively low in a lot of like these underdeveloped places. And then you have a lot of places in the Far East, right, where, and many other kind of places like this, yeah, where you have developed economies, yeah, such as Singapore, like Hong Kong, China, Japan, etc., etc. These places have very like well developed like kind of like nations and stuff, yeah, but they have relatively low levels of tax and relatively low levels of government spending. Yeah, China, like their income tax is comparable to ours. Yeah, but it's but by and large, the amount of money that's being taxed and the amount of money being spent is very different from how we'd see it in most Western places. And also as well, a notable example is Switzerland, which taxes and spends less than like most of their European counterparts, right? So when we ask about how much the government should take, it really depends on what kind of economy we have and more importantly, what we expect our government to do with that tax revenue. So hopefully on screen at the moment, you should be able to see we have a PowerPoint presentation, right? So this will show different marginal tax rates. This will show different marginal tax rates like kind of over time in both like the US and the UK and stuff, right? And so you'll see how over time the top rate of tax has changed in these places, yeah, over a period of time. So you kind of see that prior to World War II, like kind of like relatively like low levels of taxation, and then like the top rate of tax in many places goes up and up and up, all the way to when you start hitting like the 1950s and 1960s, yeah, a lot of countries have the top rate of tax being about 90%, right? So this doesn't, just to not scare you guys, right? That doesn't mean that 90% of all income that you make is taxed at 90%. It means that 90% of everything you make above a certain rate is taxed at that amount. So for instance, if you had a 90% tax rate on £1 billion, right? And if you're earning £2 billion, that means that everything above that first billion, yeah, ends up being taxed, right? So whereas everything else will be taxed at hopefully a lower rate. So that will give you some kind of indication. So don't panic, like when we say these high figures, like that's kind of what they mean, right? And obviously there was like plenty of loopholes and exemptions, etc., etc. So people rarely kind of paid those things. There was a very, very complicated tax code in those days. So if you were in the know and you were well connected, you could easily kind of get out of paying those higher rates. When we look, for instance, at what the best rate of tax should be, that itself sounds like a very simple question, but actually it's a very, very complicated one, right? And that is influenced by something we refer to as the Laffer curve, right? So here's a very, very simple demonstration. So if we had so if we're talking, for instance, you could use this for any taxation here, but if you want to use this just simply for income tax, right? If you had the income tax at 0%, right? There might be some people who might want to give some level of money to the government, but it would be, the amount of revenue you get would be probably near zero. Okay, we can think about it in that terms. Then, if we say on the flip side, 100% of the money that you earn is going to be taxed by the government, right? Now, there still would be some people who work because they just like working, etc., yeah. But at the end of the day, we work to put food on our like shelves and to kind of have a good living and stuff, right? So for most people, if they're taxed at 100%, they're going, I'm not working, that's long. Like the government's just going to take all my money, why would I go to work, right? So if we think about it in this terms, right, so we understand that at some point, if it's zero, then the level is going to be like it's going to be near zero in terms of the amount of revenue you get, and if it's 100%, it's going to be near zero, right? So we know at these two extremes that there's some sort of like thing, right? So the Laffer curve basically says that somewhere in the middle, right, there's a point at which we can have a tax rate which maximizes the amount of revenue you get, right? So, and this issue has been very, very hotly debated over the years, right? And So some people say that it's a lot lower, some people say it's a lot higher, some people say it's somewhere in the middle, right? So in reality, right, it's a thing of, we have to really also bear in mind this, right? So the amount of wealth held by the top 10% in Britain and America is more than all the wealth and all the income earned by the bottom 90%, right? So if we think about it in those terms, yeah, it's a thing of, so when we say we're taxing people, realistically we mean we're taxing like about more slightly over half of it is the top 10%, right? The top 50%, yeah, they pay about 90% of the taxes, yeah, in the country, right? So, that bottom 50% is about 10%, right? So, and, as you go further and further along, like, it becomes even less so until it becomes negligible. And the reason for this is because if people are earning below a certain threshold, yeah, we don't tend to tax them, or we tend to tax them at a very, very low rate, because we understand that the amount of money that they don't have much disposable income. They don't have much money that they can spend on things, right? And so if you tax them too much, then they won't have enough to actually be able to live. Whereas someone on a very high income, you should be able to take like relatively more money from them, because they've got more money to fall back on, so they should be all right. Like, so think about it very simply. $100,000 to Bill Gates is a drop in the ocean, right? £100,000 to you or me is going to be a significant amount, right? So this is why we have to like kind of rethink about how we administer our tax rates, and this is where the marginal tax rate comes in. So when you have, it's at 0% up until a certain threshold, then it's 20% above a certain threshold, and then it's 40% above a certain threshold, etc., whatever it is, right? So that's kind of how we kind of like do our, like, that's how taxes are actually administered in the country, and well, across many other places. So if we're looking at the Laffer curve and we're trying to work out what the ideal rate of tax would be, what the best thing to do would just be to look at the evidence of the last like 70 years, right? So shortly after World War II, like we said, like kind of you had top rates of tax around like above 90%, right? Then in about like the mid 60s, it drops to about 75%, and then with the event of like kind of the Reagan presidency and Thatcher premiership, we end up seeing rates fall down to about like kind of 40%, and in some cases, and for some years like lower than that. So for thereabouts, right, we start to see that actually the amount of revenue we end up getting ends up being very, very small in terms of, like, you would think, logically speaking, yeah, you would think that having a, like, if you ask someone, right, what would like produce more revenue, yeah, a top rate of tax at 35% or at 70%, right? And you'd obviously say, oh, 70%. But the thing is, it kind of, as we can see, it kind of plateaus, right? It doesn't significantly go up, and this is a problem that that the French government had a few years ago. They elected someone to be president, and he came in saying that it was going to be at 45%. So it was at 45% at that time, and he wanted to raise it to 75%, and people thought that there would be a whole lot more revenue because you've just raised the top rate of tax by 30%, right? So but in reality, what we find is that the amount of revenue was not nearly as much as they thought that it would be. And so if you're thinking about in those terms, it's just by raising the top rate of tax doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to get that extra revenue. So if you looked at taxes in terms of raising revenue, we can see that it kind of plateaus at a certain point, right? And so there's no magical number. Within the social sciences, this is something that people tend to struggle with, right? So in STEM subjects, so like science, maths, like engineering, etc., right? We think of exact things, we think of exact numbers, if you ask a question, there's an exact answer, right? In the social sciences, because you're dealing with millions and millions of human beings who are all very complicated and different, etc., right? There's no magic number, right? So you can't say that the Laffer curve is at 40% or at 50% or at 60%, etc., right? It's a thing of anywhere within that range, you're going to realistically generate the same level of revenue. And there's a whole bunch of different other factors that go into it, which no doubt in the comment section, people are going to be lighting up saying, there's that, like you didn't take into consideration that, or right? You're not dealing with an exact science, right? And so you just have to kind of take it as a whole and as a rough average and be like, it is somewhere between 35% and 75%. And you're not going to like it, but it's somewhere within that range. So what other functions of taxation are there, right? So there's multiple, right? So for the sake of this video, we're only going to focus on the top three. So there's raising revenue, there's disincentivizing demerit goods or services, and then there's a third one, which is redressing inequality. So we're going to go for the first one first. So disincentivizing demerit goods. So if we think about this, right, there are certain things which we know are not good for us, right, but are still legal and you can still buy them in the shops, all right? So if we think about alcohol, tobacco, if you think about you're filling up your car with petrol, etc., all these different things, right? So if you look at the number of things that the government puts taxes on, right, you'd be astounded, right? And so if you think about this in this terms, right, when you go and buy some alcohol, or when you go and buy, when you fill up your tank with petrol and stuff, right, you know, the figures have changed like little bit, right? But what it was and what it still is roughly in the ballpark of is it's roughly about 60% of the cost of that is just tax. So when you're buying XYZ in the shop, right, it's a thing of about half of those goods, right, half of it is going into tax. So this is not for all goods, right? Because for a lot of goods we have, you know, in America you have sales tax, in Britain and many other places you have VAT. So, you know, and typically the level of sales tax or VAT ranges from about, like, I don't know, like 5% for some things. Some things are completely exempt, so it's 0%, and some things are all the way up to like 20%. Some in some countries even up 25%, right? So you have those sort of taxes being levied on people, but that's just general things, right? But if the government is basically going, actually, we kind of don't really want you to do this. We can't really ban it, but we don't really want you to do this because the externalities from that, the negative externalities from that, the things that like we, you know. So for instance, if alcohol was able to be sold at the price at which people would like it to be sold at, right, you'd end up having a lot more drunkenness, you have a lot more problems with alcoholism, depression, violence, like, you know, healthcare, like kind of like bills would go up, etc., right? Same thing with smoking, like the amount of people would be getting cancer from it, like kind of like would skyrocket. All these kind of, you know, if you didn't have a tax on petrol, like kind of the amount of people, everyone would be driving, and so there'd be more pollution and more people would be sick from that, and like etc. This whole, you know, so when we think about that, we have to really think about, so the government is putting a tax on these things to say, we kind of want you to not do that. Just kind of stop doing that. Stop kind of doing that. And if you're going to do that, we're going to charge you like a lot of money for that. That's one way of getting revenue is through doing that. So the aim there is not really to like try and maximize revenue. It's like, if anything, if the government kind of there's some perverse incentives in the government then kind of secretly wanting people to do that, because if no one like does buy alcohol or like drives cars or whatever, then they'll have slightly less revenue. But it's a thing of the cost of it outweigh any kind of benefits. So that's why the government's in those instances not really interested in trying to maximize tax revenue. They're just trying to stop people from doing said thing, right, at whatever cost. And the next form we can think of is, like we said, redressing income inequality, right? So you know, like we said before, very, very rich people end up owning end up making a large percentage of the amount of money within the society. And so if that inequality there's always going to be inequality within the system. But if there's a system where there are some very, very rich people and a lot of very, very poor people who are like struggling and stuff, yeah, then there's a clear argument for having some sort of more equal distribution, right? Like the ways at which you go about that, that's like where people are kind of debating on. But it's a thing of, by and large, people, you know, there are obviously some people who think like kind of inequality doesn't matter at all, but there are some, you know, there are some benefits like kind of like to having a more equal society. Again, causation is not the same as correlation, but there is a lot of correlation between, you know, levels of happiness, like kind of like levels of crime, like all these kind of things. Like people tend to do better all round and stuff. Yeah, where there's not such a wide gap between like the very rich and the very poor, right? So if we think about it in those terms, right, it then makes sense to tax the richer people slightly more in order to give some of the money to some of the poorer people. But the amount of that distribution that you want to do, that also ties in with things, right? So someone who doesn't really want much redistribution will within that Laffer curve, they all tend more towards like having 40%, 35%, etc., right? So it'd be like, well, we're still maximizing the amount of money we have, but we're not basically punishing rich people, right? We're not disincentivizing rich people from like gaining wealth and investing in things, etc. On the other hand, you've got people who want it to be 50, 60, 70, 75%, right? Who say, well, actually, like, the rich people are still going to be making like loads of money, right? And it's not going to fully disincentivize them. So why don't we just take some of the money, which they don't really need anyway, and redistribute that and put it into infrastructure projects, etc. So this is essentially the two arguments that we have with regard to like the left and the right in like kind of in the Western world. So most of it with regard to economics is this argument about how much distribution there should be, what the top rate of tax should be, etc., etc. So if you tend to want a lower rate of tax, then you'll be more like right wing, and if you want a higher rate of tax, then you'll tend to be more left wing, right? So these are the ongoing debates about what levels of taxation there ought to be, and that's why, you know, like, don't just think that tax is something that happens, right? It's an active like debate which throughout all of our lifetime, there will always be arguments about what the rate of taxes should be on X, Y, and Z. You know, and then on top of that, we also have a system where there are some countries which are described as tax havens. This is where the top rate of tax is either at 0% or near 0%, right? The whole thing with that is that in these small countries, they tend to be, right, they basically go, right, so we'll tax like goods and services and stuff, right? You know, with VAT or whatever, but we're going to have 0% tax, right, for income, and for corporation tax, etc. So there's lots of companies which are based out in the Cayman Islands or in Luxembourg or like kind of or Monaco, etc., right? And so they're there, and people are getting an income, but they're not having to pay taxes on those things, right? So there's a huge amount of wealth. Like the figures have probably changed a little bit, but before it used to be a situation where there was $20 trillion worth of like money held in tax havens around the world. At that point, the world GDP was only $75 trillion, right? So tax havens are kind of, in some regimes, like kind of like they're a safe way of being able to store money. Like if you've got a corrupt government or etc., there's some benefits to having a tax haven, because by them having that extra money, then they can like invest it like back into the country. So like, you know, they might be able to gather more wealth from it, and then at a later point invest that same money into things, right? So it's a very complex moral argument. Some people say that they're evading tax and they're not paying what what's owed and stuff. They're making all the money in the country and then running off with it. But it's a very complex like debate and stuff, yeah, and it's certainly not as like clear cut as people kind of want to make it out. But if you do have these tax havens, especially with the age of the internet, if you, even more so than in previous times, right? If you raise the rate of tax too high, rich people can just go whoop. So it takes a long time to pass legislation, and by the time that you even started debating it, they can just go click, 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 boom, money's gone. So if that's the case, then within the age of the internet, how easy is it to lock down capital in a globalized economy? And this is something that a lot of people haven't really come to terms with yet. How are what is if people can send money across the world in the blink of an eye, then how effective are regimes for actually getting the most amount of tax that people kind of want out of rich people? A problem with this as well is that if we're going back to the question that we said at the very beginning, is taxation theft? Well, from a very rich person's perspective, they are getting very little out of the government because they send their kids to private school, they have private security, everything they have is their private healthcare, everything, right? So there's very little that they actually gain. At the same time, they are putting the vast bulk of the money into the system, right? So if we're talking about it being theft, it's not necessarily theft, but it still is a thing where, are they really getting the best value out of their money? And then also, there's a lot of other people who don't work at all, some for very good reasons, but there's other people who, are not working, and there's no real reason for them not to work. And these people are getting a lot more benefit than what they're putting into the system. So again, there's problems with there's problems with that, and then there's also another problem that people face is this: governments are never as efficient as we would like them to be. So just a simple example, right? So kind of a theoretical example: if the amount being spent per person per recipient is $10,000, but the welfare recipients themselves are only receiving $5,000, then somewhere in that we can see that there's quite a lot of overhead, right? And so on the screen at the moment, you should be able to see some of the figures, for how much is being spent per recipient. Some of these figures obviously will change over time, etc., but this is from the data I was able to compile. So if we're looking at all this, we really do have to bear in mind that actually, just because money is being spent does not mean that it's actually really necessarily going to the people that it's meant to be going to, because as with anything in life, there's going to be lots of overhead, whether it's a big corporation or whether it's a government. And because, like we said earlier, it's 803 billion pounds, $7 trillion being spent by government. If a few billion of that or more goes missing or goes into some inefficient program, who's gonna notice, right? If you or I lost £1 billion, that would be well, first of all, that'd be insane, but second, but when a government wastes £1 billion, it's well, that's a rounding error. We don't even really count that from year on year. So some of the inherent problems with taxation is that it's inefficiently spent as well. So even when you are collecting it, not all that money is going to go where it ought to go to. The economist Milton Friedman made this point, right, in terms of spending money on things and in terms of the level of efficiency. If one spends money on one's own money on oneself, then you're very, very careful to spend the right amount to get the best quality thing for yourself, right? The next form of spending is when you spend your money on someone else. So this is when you're taking someone out for dinner or you're buying them a gift or something, right? Now, you're very careful to spend that money in a very wise way, but you're not really too bothered about, the more that you kind of care about the person, the more effort you will take to make sure that it's something that they'd actually like and stuff, yeah. But you're not so bothered about what they get, just so long as it's not too expensive. The next kind, right, is where you spend someone else's money on yourself, right? So say someone, say you got a rich parent who like gives you like kind of like pocket money or whatever it is, right? Or the government gives you a handout, whatever, right? You're gonna have to just wait for that helicopter. So you're gonna spend that money, right? In a way that you're not really, because it's not your money. You've not had to work for it and stuff. It's like lottery money, right? You're just gonna spend it and you're just gonna do whatever, right? Because you've not like, because it's not really your own money and stuff. Because like you don't have as much value for that actual money, so you'll just be like, oh, whatever, do whatever. Now, this is the fourth type of spending. This is the most inefficient one, right? This is where you take someone else's money and give it to someone else, right? So you take from person A and then you give to person C, right? And so you're person B and you're the tax man in this scenario, right? So you're the government, right? So you're taking money from wealthy person A and you're given to poor person C, but in the meantime, you want to like pay yourself a nice like middle class like kind of like income, and you're not really too bothered how the money really gets spent on person C. You're just kind of throw that money there, and you're gonna try and take as much money as possible from person A, because at the end of the day, it's not coming out of your pocket, so you don't really care how much you have to take from them. You don't really care how much gets spent, as long as you've got a nice cushy 9 to 5 job, right? So even with the best intentions, right, the inherent problem with government spending is that actually we end up with a situation where the least efficient amount of money is being distributed in that way, right? So, but at the same time, it's obviously still necessary. So we can't fully say, well, because it's inefficient, we have to completely scrap it entirely. It is still a thing of we still do need government, we still do need taxation. So the real debate comes with what is the most amount that we need from person A, yeah, and what's the most amount we have to give to person C in order to get the best result. So we're not taking too much from person A and we're giving enough for person C, right? So this is the argument about how efficient the spending is, right? That is another big determinant on whether you're like left wing or right wing, because right wing people who are more fiscally conservative, say, tend to focus a lot more on how efficiently government like welfare programs are being spent, right? Whereas people who are left wing are not as concerned. They're more concerned with making sure that the distributions that, so even if person A gets taxed more and person C like kind of is just given loads of money that they like spend on like nonsense, right? It still is a thing of, well, the inherent just the act alone of taking a lot of money from this person who's very wealthy and giving it to that person ends up balancing out the income inequality scale, right? So just that alone is inherent good in itself. So they're not so bothered about how efficiently this money is spent, so long as the scales are balanced a little bit more. So these are some of the really important kind of like debates which are really at the heart of the debate about taxation. And so if you like this video, you know what to do already. Subscribe, yeah, stay tuned for a lot more videos. And you need to like the video as well. You don't have to like them, you could dislike them, yeah. But if you genuinely enjoyed it, it doesn't take very long, just a little boom, and then, that helps out the channel a lot. That, incentivizes us to get a lot more. So in terms of, so let's think about this in economic terms, right? I've spent multiple hours filming, editing, and like uploading, etc., right? Getting everything all nice and sorted. I had to plan this out. This took probably maybe 5 hours to do, maybe slightly more, right? You just need to watch it for maybe however long it lasts for, and then you just need to go broop and broop. See that's maybe a 2, maybe 3 second operation. Maybe if you need to sign in to YouTube account, that might take I don't know, maybe 30 seconds. Maybe if you haven't set one up already, maybe that will take you maybe 3 minutes to set up at best, like 2 if you're somewhat competent thing. So yeah, it's not rocket science. It will take 2 minutes of your time, and it's taken 5 hours of my time, right? So actually, in many regards, you guys, this is extortion in a way, right? I'm putting a lot of cost into it, and not at the moment getting as much return from it. Whereas you've got a nice succinct video talking about taxation and stuff, and the complexities of it, as well as all the other things that this channel has to offer. So do me a favor, and and it comes at no cost to you. It takes literally no cost, just a little tiny bit of your time for a large amount of my time. With that said, have a great day. Bye.